Namaskar viewers, hello and welcome to Sunset TV. I am Tina Jha, you're watching Perspective. India is headed to lead the G20 countries from the position of strength and will leave a mark on the world for years to come during its next year's presidency. So as India takes over the presidency of the G20 in December this year, the IMF MD expressed optimism, saying from its position of strength, India will be leaving a mark on the world for several years to come. What kind of mark is India expected to bring about? What are some of the structural reforms that have brought India to this position of strength about which the IMF MD spoke about? Also, how is India bracing itself for the G20 presidency? This and much more in perspective today with an illustrious panel of experts joining me on the program. Pleased to welcome Ms. Elizabeth Braw, Resident Fellow, American Enterprise Institute, London, former Ambassador Prabhu Dayal, and Dr. Sreeram Chaulia, Foreign Affairs expert. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program today. Dr. Chaulia, before we delve deeper into the opportunities and the aspirations for India as G20 chair, let me get your perspective on what the IMF MD has said. It's sort of an endorsing view about India's growth trajectory. What, according to you, have been some of the highlights, some of the critical factors that have brought India today to this position of strength and which have also raised expectations of the world in terms of helping other countries, in terms of leaving a mark behind as G20 chair?
Tina, first of all, I think the fiscal management was much superior. And during the pandemic, the countries that are saying we should spend 10% of GDP on stimulus packages and all that. But actually, the way Narendra Modi government handled the finances, we are a lot more stable. You see so many countries falling apart under the pressure of this ongoing energy, food, and financial crisis. But India is very stable. And I think the management, macroeconomic management through the crisis period, last 2.5, 3 years, despite the lockdowns and all that, was tremendous. So that's what is giving us this position of strength the IMF chief is talking about. The second, of course, is the digitization and major reforms that we have done with regard to financial inclusion. So a lot more people are now beneficiaries of government schemes. The level of corruption has been reduced to a great extent. So there are a lot of, I think, fundamental reforms that we have done. And also unleashing the entrepreneurial spirits, the startup culture. You see, the pace at which these things are happening, it's a ray of hope for the world. And on the diplomatic front also, I think not just IMF, but the entire G20, what they're expecting is that India will act as a big unifying force, because we have the world divided into multiple camps, especially over the Russia-Ukraine war. There's a lot of tension, and there have been G20 preparatory summits to the Indonesia summit this year, where some ministers have walked out when the Russian minister has been talking. Then there's even a fear there will be no joint declaration, which would be a disaster. So I think India quietly is working as part of the Troika, along with Indonesia, which is the current host, and Italy, which was last year's host. And we are actually working towards making sure there is unity and unanimity and consensus on core issues that matter. And India has, of course, a long list of priorities. It's going to come in with a lot of developmental agenda of its own once we take over the presidency. So I think the overall positivity stems from this dual factor, that we are strong domestically, economically doing very well, relatively speaking. And secondly, we are constructive and building bridges to make sure G20 stays together.
Wherever there are opportunities, Professor Chaulia, there are also challenges. And one big challenge for India is going to be, apart from bringing a host of issues, the fact that what Ambassador was mentioning, that it's a divided world today. And to synthesize divergent views as being the chair is going to be a difficult task, isn't it?
Yeah, especially there are two divergences. One is the political divisions and the geopolitical, contestation you're seeing among the major powers in different parts of the world. And the second is, whenever there is a large-scale global recession or downturn, then each country tries to go its own way when it comes to solutions. And G20 was initially created way back in 2009 to address this problem and to create some kind of a coordination among all the major economies, keeping in mind that there is a single global economy. So to make sure both of these parallel tracks, which of course also intersect at some point, the political and the economic, that there is not so much fractiousness that we don't really have any solutions at all. I think that's the big challenge for India. And our Sherpas and our representatives, that's why we are holding so many consultative meetings. Our plan is to hold 200 or more. And there are many smaller mechanisms within G20, like the Youth 20, the L20 labor unions, the think tanks. All of these, India is actually outdoing all the previous hosts in terms of organizing more and more gatherings and collecting opinions, because there is also perception, especially among those who are not part of G20. Remember, there are 173, or actually 174 nation states which are not part of G20. The G20 is 19 countries plus EU. So these 174 should not also be left behind. That's why there is something called outreach groups. So we are now planning to invite a range of other developing countries from various continents to be there in Delhi next year when we are hosting the G20, so that they don't feel left out and they don't feel like these are just the major economies and they have a selfish agenda and that they don't want to share. So India's strength really is to voice the LDCs, as we call least developed countries, small island developing countries. That is our strength, and we are going to make sure their interests are not trampled upon by selfish motivations of anybody. I mean, if this war continues, I mean, there are some who are saying that we will only stop the war when Russia is defeated. But if that is the case, this is going to last forever, or probably for several months, several more months or years. So I think the position of least developed countries, which India is also voicing, is we need to stop this. Otherwise, the repercussions are so huge. We're talking about, yes, there has been mass tragedy in Europe, but it could be amplified multiple times with hundreds of millions of people not being able to put food on the table or to survive this coming crisis. So I think we are going to bring in that element also to say, look at the larger picture. We are 7 billion people on this planet, and everyone is suffering from this war. It's not just the Ukrainians. So we need to make sure that there is a solution that comes in which addresses these larger planetary problems that we are facing. And that is where I think India's strength, traditionally, our multilateral diplomacy is based on that, to bring along large groups and to find common ground. So I'm pretty sure the baton, as it's handed over from Indonesia to India, it's two big developing countries, one after the other, who are going to handle G20 affairs. So I think that's a positive sign in terms of timing also, that we are going in with a clear agenda for the SDGs. The Sustainable Development Goals are really under threat.
Yes.
Since the pandemic began, and now with this new recession and the war, there's no hope at all that any of these major goals like poverty reduction and gender equality, all these will be met. We are all regressing actually as a result of these cascading crises. So how to stop this regression, how to put a floor under this fall, the free fall that is happening, and how to revive the global economy in a fair and equitable manner, I think that is ultimately the test. So these are the big challenges, and we are up for it. And I think Prime Minister's leadership is going to be critical, because while we have a whole infrastructure and paraphernalia, all the ministries, everyone is now out there on the field working on G20 substructures. Ultimately, top leadership and breaking the log jams, making sure key people talk to other key people, and being there. I think India has a huge role as a facilitator, if not a mediator, for these global crises to be managed.
I would like to thank all of our panelists once again for joining us on the program today, sharing your thoughts with us and our viewers.